Hi everyone, I'm Robbie Bieber and welcome back to another Collodion chat. So today what I want to talk about is digitizing your plates, specifically digitizing your plates by copy photography, right? Using a digital camera to take a photo of your wet plate. Now, in general, if you have access to a good flatbed scanner that can fit the plates that you're making, I highly recommend just scanning the plates. It's roughly 1,000,000 times easier than setting up a copy photo rig. But sometimes it's not an option, right? You may not have access to a scanner, might not be able to afford a good flatbed scanner, or you might be making plates that are too big. So I normally scan my plates, but I've been messing around with a 5x12 camera lately, and this plate is too big for my scanner. So we had the Florida Wet Plate Day meetup a couple weeks ago, and it was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, I got very sick about halfway through, and I only got a couple of plates made. But I have this one 5x12 scene of the springs there at Wegawa Springs State Park that I'm pretty fond of. So I'm going to try to make a copy of this in this video. But first, I'm going to talk a bunch about kind of the theory behind copy photography, because this is a subject that comes up pretty frequently in Collodion, Facebook groups and forums, and I see a lot of advice that is either incomplete or maybe a little bit questionable, right? And so I think the best thing you can do to produce good results here is not to buy any particular piece of equipment or to follow like a strict procedure that someone lays down, but to actually understand how this all works and why we get the results we get when we do the things we do, so that you can adapt to the plates and the equipment that you have on hand to get the results you need to get. So if you just want to see kind of step-by-step how I copy this plate, I will put chapter markers on this so you can skip all the boring theory. But if you want the whole thing, let's go ahead and dive into it. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the basic principle, right? What makes copy photography difficult? So in theory, I should just be able to hold this sucker up, maybe stick it to a wall or lay it on a table, take a camera, point it at it, take a picture, right? And you can do that, and sometimes by sheer accident, you'll get good results. But a lot of the times you won't. And there's a handful of issues that are going to cause problems in your copy plates that I think make people think that copy work is more difficult than it is. And it's really just they don't know what are the problems that are kind of creeping up to bite them. So let's take a look at some of those, right? And the first and probably the most notorious is glare, right? So I'm just going to take this plate, I'm going to swivel it towards the light fixture on the ceiling here, and you can see that big nasty glare. So what is glare, right? I think it's easy to be very frustrated by glare, and it's especially frustrating if you don't know what causes it or how to eliminate it. Now, glare is what we would call a direct reflection, right? So there's different types of reflected light. When light hits, say the wall behind me or my face, right, it just kind of bounces off in every direction. Right? That's what we call diffuse reflection. And it's what conveys most of the visual information that we take in to our eyes, right? Usually when we're seeing something, we're seeing the diffuse reflection of light that bounced off of it back to our eyes. But sometimes light reflects directly, right? Which means the ray doesn't hit the surface and kind of scatter off in different directions. It hits it and it bounces off directly, right? Things that typically produce direct reflections are surfaces that we would think of as shiny, right? So glass, tin types. A mirror is, of course, kind of the platonic ideal of a reflective surface, right? So the thing that makes a mirror is that it produces almost no diffuse reflection, and it produces pretty much all direct reflection, right? Most objects are not all or nothing, right? So you can think of like an extremely matte surface would be a surface that would produce almost no direct reflection, but most things produce somewhere in the middle, right? Metals, glasses, anything that has a sheen to it is going to potentially produce a little bit of direct reflection. And, you know, a metal tin type or a glass amber type is going to be on that end of the spectrum where you do get, in addition to the light scattering off of it, which allows us to see the image, right, the thing we actually want to photograph, you are going to get quite a bit of direct reflection, right? So when direct reflection is unwanted, we call it glare. And when reflection is wanted, we just call it a direct reflection, or if we want to be fancy, we call it a specular highlight. But for now, we'll call it glare, because when we're doing copy work, we don't want direct reflection. So how do we avoid it? A recommendation that comes up a lot in the wet plate groups is to use a technique called cross-polarization. And the idea there is that you get two polarizing filters, one for your light, one for your lens, and you put them at 90-degree angles to each other, and that way the direct reflection from the light is polarized, and then the polarizing filter on your lens blocks it so you don't get any glare. I'm not going to go into how polarization works. It's unnecessary because I'm not going to tell you to use cross-polarization because I don't think it's necessary. It works well, but this is a problem that we can also solve with geometry, and geometry is free and doesn't require you to buy any additional equipment. So I'm going to suggest that we just take a look at how we can get a good copy photo of a plate just using irregular camera lights, no polarizers required, right? So what causes glare? What causes glare is essentially when there is a direct path that a light ray can take from a light source, bouncing off your surface, and then back into the camera lens, right? So if we just draw a little silly diagram on the whiteboard here, we can imagine we've got our camera, and we'll say this is a top-down view, right? So we've got our camera, we've got our plate over here, and let's say that we have a light right here, right? So this light is going to shine on the plate, which is good. We want to illuminate it. This is actually, is this an okay example? Yeah, this is okay. So we'll say this shines, let's actually put the light more here. Yeah. So we'll say our light shines on the plate, which is good, but that ray is going to reflect back into the camera's lens. So we're also going to get glare, right? And so the way that I like to think of this when I'm setting up a scene is I think of the plate as if it is literally a mirror, right? Imagine that you can look into the plate like it's a mirror and see your surroundings. If you can see your light source in that imaginary mirror, and if it helps you to visualize, you can put an actual literal mirror in the place of your plate, right? But if you can see the light in that mirror, that means that it's going to reflect off the plate and back into your lens, right? So how do we avoid that? Well, we can actually visualize by drawing some lines here. We can visualize the range of positions where our light will reflect into the camera lens, right? So we can just draw some lines from the outsides of our camera lens here. And of course, this is a very kind of idealized diagram, and I'm going to do a bad job of reflecting these rays, but and my marker's giving out too, which is great. Let me grab a different marker. We can imagine, just kind of tracing some rays out from our lens. At roughly the same angle that this ray hits the plate, it's going to bounce off. And effectively, this entire triangular area that's contained within these rays, right? If we put our lights, so we can't put our lights in this triangle, right? Because in this triangle, anything that we put in here is going to be visible to the camera. It would get in the way of the plate. In these outer triangles, anything that we place, right, any light that we put here is going to have a path where it can reflect off of the plate and into the lens. But any light that we put outside of that cone is going to be safe because its light will reflect onto the plate and off away from the camera on either side. So there's two things to take note of here, right? First of all, This is not necessarily going to be a thing that you need to like draw diagrams on the floor, right? You can just do some experiments with some light positions, and as long as you have this conceptually in your mind, you can know, well, if my light's showing up in the plate, I need to move it either closer to the plate this way to get it out of that cone, or I need to move it farther off to the side, right? So you know directionally what you need to do to avoid getting your light in that zone where it produces glare. The other thing that I want to note here is that the angles of these cones is going to depend on the distance between the camera and the plate, right? So let's say that we bring this camera up super, super close to the plate, right? I'm gonna put it right here. Now these angles are very broad and we project a very large cone where we're gonna get glare, right? This makes it much harder to position our lights. Whereas if we back the camera way up, right? Let's say that we put it all the way out here. Well, now these lines between the edges of the plate and the edges of the lens, they're extremely shallow. They're almost horizontal lines on our diagram, which means they're going to cast a much narrower cone, right? And this gives us more room up here to place our lights in. So we're talking about these cones versus if the camera was up here, we'd be looking at, you know, these cones, right? Which would be much bigger. So this is our first principle. The longer the lens you can apply to this problem, the less potential for glare, right? The more flexibility you're gonna have in arranging your lights. So rule number one, don't get your camera right up on top of the plate if you can help it. I'm not saying you necessarily have to use a long lens from way across the room, but if you can, it's gonna make things a little bit easier on you. So that's glare, right? Now, how do we avoid glare? How do we avoid getting into this triangle? Well, we got the distance, right? Get far away from the plate if we can. And the other thing is we're gonna wanna use small lights, right? So let's draw our cones again. And we drew our lights as these kind of little, you know, light bulb shaped things. Imagine if instead of a little light bulb, we had like a great big softbox, right? Well, now we're making things harder on ourselves because that great big softbox can be positioned over here, right? This is the center of the softbox. If we put a single light there, it wouldn't produce glare. But if we put a softbox here, well, now the edges of it are kind of creeping in and putting some glare on the edges of our plates. So principle number two, we're gonna wanna favor smaller lights here. And this is something that I see people recommend less, but unfortunately people do sometimes recommend using a large light source for copy work. And in this case, we really don't need to, right? So in general, right, if you're not super familiar with lighting, you probably have this idea in your head. You know, if you know a little bit about lighting, you're probably gonna think big lights are good, small lights are bad, right? It's a general principle. Big lights are soft, small lights are harsh. And we have to think about why that's the case, right? So what does it mean when we say that a large light is soft, right? I've got a really big LED light fixture on my ceiling here that gives me a relatively soft appearance on my face here in my office when I'm on video calls or right now recording from my whiteboard, right? And what that actually means, right? Some people will express this as there's more shadows when you have a smaller light source and fewer shadows when you have a big light source. It's not a matter of more or less shadows, right? There's the same number of shadows regardless of the size of the light. It's the character of the shadow that's different. So if I turn my head to the light source, if there were a really tiny light on the ceiling here, you would see a really sharp, defined shadow on my cheek, right? Which is what people tend to think of as harsh lighting, and we tend to consider that unattractive, unappealing in portrait photography, usually, unless we're trying to like make someone look tough, you know, or give them kind of a gritty look, right? Nothing is really concretely bad or good. It just depends on the look you're going for. But usually we don't consider a really hard lighting appearance to be, especially attractive. However, when we go to that soft light, right, that just means the shadow is still there, right? Shadows don't disappear with soft lights. They're very important, actually, to be able to see the shape of the object you're photographing. What happens is the shadow gets more diffuse, right? Instead of a really harsh, sharp line, you have kind of a transition zone where it's really light on the side of the face, and then you have it gets gradually darker as you come into the shadow of the nose, right? And that's what we call a soft look. So that's all very important for things like human faces that have texture, right? That hard and that soft look is produced by the fact that there are features on my face that stick out further away from and closer to the camera, and they cast shadows, and those shadows can have a character that has an aesthetic value for us, right? Now that can be an issue in copy photography for some things, right? If you're photographing like a textile that has a lot of texture to it, or maybe a tile mosaic or a painting that has a lot of texture, then the size and the positioning of your lights can affect the way that the surface, the textured surface is going to look, right? If you get a light that's really small, really far off to the side, it casts little shadows from kind of the high parts of the surface. But the really nice thing about tintypes is that they're flat. They have no texture to speak of. I mean, I guess, maybe the silver is a couple microns higher than the background, but for all intents and purposes, these are flat, which means we don't have to worry about the size or the position of our light, at least not in terms of the texture. So that was a really unnecessarily long-winded way to explain the fact that you don't need a softbox for copying a tintype. You don't need a big diffuse daytime sky in the shadow of clouds. You don't need a strip box. You don't need a beauty dish. A bare bulb or a strobe and a reflector will do just fine. You don't need a big light source. Keep it small, make life easier on yourselves. So that's kind of, I think, a good treatment of glare. I think that covers the main sources of glare and how to avoid it. So now I'm going to take a really quick break, and we will come back to the next issue with copied tintypes. Okay, so I know I said I was going to cover the next topic next. There's actually like a part 1A we need to do here, because I was just talking about keeping your light sources small to make life easier on you. We need to include our surroundings in that, right? So this is another problem that I think a lot of people run into when they use lights indoors to try to do copy photography, or they try to do it outside, right? We just talked a lot about how your light source can reflect off of your plate into your lens. But remember, we also said that there's diffuse reflections, right? So light bounces off of everything that it hits. That means that everything around you is also potentially a light source that can produce glare. If you're lighting up the plate, but you're also lighting up the room around you very bright, then you have to worry about getting glare to a much lower extent, but still visible, right? You'll see an image as if in a mirror of the room around you that you've lit up. So the way to avoid that is just to make sure that your plate that you're copying is much brighter than the environment around it. You want to crank that light up so high that the rest of the room is effectively pitch black. Or you could photograph in a really dark room, but personally I don't like working in the dark. My preference is to just make the plate really bright and make sure that I use light limiting modifiers, right? So you can use a snoot if you have one. I usually just wrap like a cinefoil tube around my light. It's like black aluminum foil, just to make sure that I'm as narrowly as possible aiming that light at my plate. I don't want to light up the rest of the room because I don't want it to show up as a reflection in the plate. Grid spots are another very common modifier used to kind of limit the spread of light. You're going to want to avoid those Grid spots are great. They have this really neat property, which is they create a bright spot that has kind of a gradual fall off away from it. It looks really great as like the background light of a portrait. It's not good for copywork though, because you want to evenly light your plate. Which brings us to our actual second topic, which is the evenness of the light. There's probably a better way to phrase that, but I don't care. So another big problem, especially this happens a lot if people are trying to light their plate with just a single light, is that light falls off very rapidly from a light source, right? So there's this thing called the inverse square law, which says that the brightness of a subject that's lit by a light source is going to be inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the light. I'm not going to try to get too deep into the math there. I'm just going to draw a really quick diagram to kind of roughly explain this. Let's say that we've got a plate, right, that we're trying to photograph, and we've got a light source right here, right? It's really close to the plate. So let's take 3 points along the plate. Let's say A and B and C. And let's say that the distance between the light and A is the same as the distance between A and B is the same as the distance between B and C, right? We'll say this is 1 meter away from the light, this is 2 meters, this is 3 meters. It's a really gargantuan plate, I guess. But the point here is that you might think, you know, point B is twice as far from the light as point A, so it's going to be half as bright. And point C is 3 times as far away, so it's going to be 1/3 as bright. But that's not how it works. What actually happens is point B, because it's twice as far away from the light as point A, is 1/4 as bright. That is to say, it is 2 stops darker than point A. And point C is going to be 1/9 as bright, which is more than 3 stops darker than point A. So if this were an actual plate we're trying to photograph, right, like this side would be super, super bright, and in the middle it would be falling off very quickly. It would not be very bright at all there. And on the outside, it would be extremely dim, right? So you may not have as exaggerated of an example as this, but this is an effect that can really show up in your plates if you're getting the lights too close to them, right? So what can we do to mitigate this? There's 2 things we can do. The first thing is move the plate farther away from the light, right? So imagine that same diagram, but this time our plate's all the way over here. We've got point A, point B, and point C. And we'll say point B is like 1.1 times farther, and point C is like 1.2 times farther from the light, right? Because the total distance from the light is much bigger here. Now we're still getting some significant fall off over here, but it's not nearly as bad as it was when the light was right up close here, right? So we're going to want to try and get our lights farther away. Now that conflicts a little bit with our approach to glare, because, you know, as you can recall, we drew out our triangle of death diagram here, right? This area that we don't want to put our light in. And because this is a cone that gets bigger in this direction, the farther away you move your plates from the light, the less space you have to work with, right? Because in reality, we're probably not in like an aircraft hangar here. We're in a room, and there's going to be walls around us. And so the farther away we get from the plate in this direction, the farther we have to go out this way. And eventually we're bumping into walls or furniture and just making our lives more difficult. So this is the trade-off we have to work with, right? We're going to want to try to stick close to the edge of this cone as far away as we can practically get from the plate. This also conflicts with our desire to keep the light as narrow as possible, right? Because the farther away you get your light, the broader its cone spreads out, and it's going to tend to light those surroundings. So now you need a tighter snoot or a longer cone of cinefoil or whatever to keep the light narrow. So these are all trade-offs, right? We've got to try to find the most practical application here, and this is usually going to be something that we do experimentally. We move the light around until we get something that works really well. And then the other thing that we can do that's going to help a lot is we don't use one light, right? So we've got our plate, our camera, our cone of death where we can't put our lights. And wherever we have one light, we want to have another light the same distance from the plate, but on the other side. And this is what we call cross lighting. And this works really well because what's happening here is, let's say that this is light A and this is light B, right? So light A is going to be brightest over here. Let's just draw a little graph here, right? So let's say that light A is going to fall off like this, right? It's brighter on this edge and it falls off towards the end. Well, light B is going to do the opposite. It's going to be the brightest on this side, and it's going to fall off towards the other side. And so what we get is in the middle, where both lights are at their weakest, they add together. And at the edges, one light is really bright and one light is really weak. So it kind of ends up, right, we can imagine that, let's make a more legible graph here, right? Let's say that light A is maybe kind of falling off from left to right here, and light B is kind of falling off from right to left. And when we add these together, we end up with a graph that is not perfectly flat, but it's closer. In practice, with cross-lighting, you can get your whole plate to look evenly lit. In reality, maybe it's 2% darker in the center than it is at the edges, but you can get it very close enough that no human eye is ever going to tell the difference. So that is our second big problem, right? Evenness of the light. And what do we do about it? We move the lights as far away as we can, and we also cross-light. And that is, I think, basically all we need theory-wise, right? So let's recap real quick. What have we learned here? We want to, one, get the plate. I'm not going to write these all by hand. I'll put them on the screen. Number one, we want to write the plate. We want to get the plate far away from the camera to get us the narrowest possible, we'll call it an exclusion zone, right? The narrowest exclusion zone we can. Give us the best range possible to place our lights. We want to, number two, make our lights small. We don't want big, broad lights here because we're not shooting a surface with texture. We're shooting a flat tintype. It has no texture. It has no shadows to be hard or soft. So make those lights small to give you the least possibility of creating glare. Number three, avoid lighting your environment. All right, we want to make sure that the only thing we're shining light on is the plate. And we want that light to be so bright that the environment around us is not going to reflect in our plate in the final image. We want to make sure that the only light that our camera can really pick up is the image on our plate. And then we're going to move to getting our lights even. What are our principles there? Number one, we want to get our light as far away from the plate as possible, because if we get the light really close, the inverse square law kind of kicks us in the teeth. It makes one side of our plate a lot brighter than the other. So we want to get that light far away to minimize that effect. And then the other thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to cross light. We're going to want to take one light and mirror it with a second light on the opposite side of the image. Those two are going to cross over. One is going to be really bright on one side, one is going to be really bright on the other side, and they're going to kind of combine so that it evens out and you get something very close to perfectly flat lighting all the way across the plate. And that is the theory, right? That's the stuff that we need to know the things that we need to know to create a good copy photograph of a wet plate image. If you want more of this type of thing, I'm pretty sure I recommended this book before, but get yourself a copy of Light, Science, and Magic and just read the whole thing through. It's an excellent book on lighting. It has a really extensive section on copy photography, not just for flat surfaces like our tin types, but also for things with texture, right? Like textiles and paintings and so on, and the various considerations that you need. This whole little spiel I just gave you is probably just a bad summary of my reading of that chapter like 10 years ago. So yeah, that's our theory. Now I'm going to record the next section tomorrow. I'm probably going to take you out to the garage because I think that showing my messy garage on camera is going to be less embarrassing than showing my messy living room on camera. And we will go ahead and we will copy this plate. So until tomorrow, which is not going to be tomorrow for you, it's going to be about 1 second in the future for you. I will see you then. Welcome back to the eerily dark garage. I know I said I was going to record this part tomorrow, and then a little bit of life kind of happened, and so now it is actually about a month later. Now, this is a tricky thing to demonstrate because obviously I would prefer to have this whole environment lit, but I also want to really clearly show the effect of the lights on the plate. So the garage here is mostly dark, but hopefully you can at least see enough of my shadow for me to point things out. So a couple basic points to make here. First of all, anytime you're doing copy work like this, you're gonna have a choice to make, and that is, do you wanna put the plate vertical or horizontal, right? And they each have their drawbacks. So usually I try to work with with a vertically oriented plate. And you can see here what I've done is I've just taken kind of a music stand here, and I've clipped a piece of white foam core to it, and then I just stuck the plate on with a piece of double stick tape. Now obviously that doesn't work for amber types, but it works fine for tin types. And personally, I find it easier to work with a situation where the plate is just sitting straight up. And that way I can really easily move my lights around kind of in regular two-dimensional space. And I also can set my camera up regularly on the tripod. Now, if you work with a plate lying down on, say, a table, then it's much easier to lay the plate down. You know, you don't have to worry about how to hold the plate up. But of course, at that point, you're gonna have to worry about getting your camera oriented vertically as well as your lights. So, you know, if you have a copy stand, that can work really well for this kind of thing. But if you don't have one, it can be easier to work with a vertical plate. But ultimately, it's up to you. I've done both. I just find this is usually a little bit easier. And another point that I want to make here is that I've got two speedotrons set up here. You absolutely do not need speedotrons to copy a plate. I would normally do this with just a regular cheap pair of speed lights. The reason I have the speedotrons out is just because I wanted to be able to demonstrate the effects of the lighting on video. And obviously my little cheap speed lights don't have modeling lamps, and my speedotrons do. So I brought them out to use them for this demonstration. Now, like I mentioned, it's been probably over a month since I recorded the last part of the video. The plate was already at least a couple weeks old at that point. This plate is not varnished. So I just want to point out that if you have plates that you haven't gotten around to varnishing yet, it's not the end of the world if it takes you a little bit of time. I have plates that are a couple of years old that I just never varnished because I didn't like them that much. I never got around to throwing them out. And none of them are like visibly tarnished, okay? So remember that varnishing is an important step for kind of long-term durability of the plate, and just to, you know, make it easier to handle without damaging, but it's not something you have to get to right away. So if you have a backlog of plates that haven't been varnished yet, don't feel bad about it. So let's take a look at our setup here. I've got two speedotrons. Each one of these is a 102 head. I just made some really simple little makeshift snoots out of cinefoil here, which is just black aluminum foil. And so what I have done here is I'm cross-lighting left to right. I'm also cross-lighting up and down. So this light over here on your right side is positioned low and to the right, and it is actually aimed up at the upper left corner of that foam core. This light over here is positioned high and on the left, and it is pointed at the lower right side. So we're feathering both, basically we're going to the opposite side in both dimensions, or sorry, on both axes from each light. Now, I'm just going to turn this one light off, and I'm not sure if you can really see on camera the amount of difference that makes. Yeah, it looks almost perfectly even on camera anyways, but the light is now a little bit more focused on that lower right corner. And then if I leave this one, or sorry, on the upper left corner, and if I leave that one on and turn this one off, we'll now see the light a little bit more focused on the lower right. But the image on the camera still looks fairly even. So another kind of overarching point here to keep in mind is that we talked a lot about the theory of copy work. In practice, it tends not to be that difficult. You know, with regular, you know, large format plates and reasonable distances, you're generally not going to have a super hard time getting an even light, or sorry, an evenly lit plate without glare. And I also want to point out that I brought this camera really close, like almost on top of the plate that I'm photographing, just to exaggerate the effect of glare. And these lights are still, you know, they're not very far away from the image. They're pretty close in, and they're still not producing any glare on the plate. So now I'm going to pick up this right-hand light, and I'm going to show you just how far over I have to bring this to produce any glare. And I've got to get this sucker all the way over here, almost right behind the camera, before it starts to move into that cone where it's problematic. So keep in mind that in practice, if you can get a little bit of distance between your camera and your light, you're probably not going to have a big problem with glare. You just need a little bit of room to work in so that you don't have to be right on top of everything. And like I said, I didn't move this camera up to exaggerate the effect. When I actually took the image that I'm going to put up on the screen now, I was like probably 2 meters farther away from that plate. I was all the way back here. And at this point, it's extremely difficult to get any glare off of the plate. So that is a quick kind of practical demonstration of our setup. I'm also going to throw the final image up here on the screen. And like I said, just remember, you don't need this much equipment to pull this off. All you need are 2 lights. You could really probably get away with even 1 light if it's a decent distance away from the plate. You need some stands to put them on, and you need a camera. So if you already have a digital camera, you know, probably $100 worth of speed lights will get you a perfectly functional copy setup. It's a little bit of a pain to set up, but that's what you got to do if you have a bigger plate. Copy stands are also great if you have one, but don't feel like you need one. You can absolutely work with a vertically oriented plate, just kind of in any open space that you have available. So hopefully that's a good demonstration of how to copy a plate, and I will go ahead and leave you with that. And until next time, hope you enjoyed this, and good luck with your wet plate endeavors.